Law Lab. I'm Neil Taylor, host of Corporate Law Lab and director of the Corporate Law Center at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. My guest today is Ed Doyle, who I've known for many years and has the distinction, happy for him, of being the first non-lawyer guest here on Corporate Law Lab. Welcome, Ed.
It's great to be with you again, Neil. Good to see you as well.
You too. Let's talk about why you're here. Then we'll talk a little bit about your background so we can remove the mystery as to why are we talking to a non-lawyer in these hallowed halls. And it's, as I was preparing for the externship class I teach on a lot of professionalism and issues, and got to the module on negotiation and active listening, I said, I don't know anybody that knows more about this than Ed, so he's going to be on the podcast, and that's what we're going to talk about after we talk about a little bit of background. That's a big ask for you, that you're now the person that knows the most about this that I know, which either says something about the people that I hang around with, or is quite a compliment to you. So you're a proper New Yorker, as we would. Now, proper that's how we would say it in London, but
Right. No, I understand. Yes, born and raised. Yes,
you grew up in the Washington Heights neighborhood. Is that right?
yes, north end of Manhattan, and then the family moved to the Bronx, or we used to like to say we catapulted up the social ladder and moved to the Bronx.
And your parents were Irish immigrants, right?
Yes, they were.
Okay. What was that like growing up there?
Well, it was a close-knit community in Washington Heights where we lived. There were numbers of immigrant families. So we grew up within essentially two cultures, one purely American and the other a little bit more European. More European in the house and certainly 100% American outside the house. Growing up in the Bronx, those were interesting years to be young, and it was challenging at times. My high school was pretty far away from the house, and there were no school buses. You took regular transportation to and from. And then I went to Fordham University just to keep the action of taking public transportation to and from an education center. So
You never got more than 5 miles from home.
sometimes I did, but not often.
What did you study at Fordham?
Well, I studied pre-med/science and literature. I had a double major and came out and thought maybe medical school might be in the future, but having spent some time doing both volunteer and paid work in the New York hospitals and then an ambulance, I decided I'm going to go with my parallel enjoyment, which is geopolitics and international news and interests.
So that led you into government service. You were a career foreign service officer assigned to the State Department.
Yes. And I did a lot of travel, different national security matters around the world for a period of time, and then subsequently entered the corporate sector, which I think you're aware of.
Yeah, which is where we met. And so in the mid-90s, I guess, then after about 15 years with the government,
That's correct.
you joined the Stenbeck group of companies, which included Millicom, which I was later joined as the general counsel. Just talk a little bit about who Jan Stenbeck was. He was quite a character. I never got to meet him, but the stories are legion.
Yes. Jan, first of all, he died in 2002, so I use past tense for him, right? And he was an entrepreneur who was part of a Swedish family that had several corporate holdings in Sweden. Jan came to the United States for postgraduate education at Harvard, and then he became joined Morgan Stanley. He became a Morgan Stanley partner. With a death in the family, Jan was asked to take over the family businesses. He did that. He went back to Europe and lived among Stockholm, Luxembourg, and New York. The primary residence was in the United States.
Back then, the family business was paper mills and forests? Is that
steel,
right?
paper mills, and a little bit of technology, but very, very nascent in that focus. He changed the focus of the corporation. He kept the forestry business, which was substantial, and he moved some of the other assets into the technology, media, telecommunications world. And he began to build the current operation in Europe called Tele2, which has a large footprint in the mobile telephony world. He started that company, and he started Millicom to seek cellular operating licenses in the emerging markets, which was rather novel for the time that he did that. So he was a forward-leaning entrepreneur and somewhat of a visionary. And I worked directly for him. He's a very interesting man, and he was very good to me, a great mentor and rather kind.
So your role there was, I mean, you were called executive VP. We were
Yes.
chatting before we went on about how you had different business cards for different purposes, but you were spent a lot of your time across the different companies before becoming, I guess, more focused on Millicom. Was that just because Millicom got to be the biggest one?
Well, a little bit by default. I joined initially the U.S. holding company of Jan's assets that were in the States. And the leaning there was technology. There was some technology. So the portfolio companies were technology, finance, and consulting predominantly. From there, then I would go be supportive of some of the European operations. All of this was directed by Mr. Stenbeck. And after a period of time, he brought me to his offices, housed me in those offices, and moved me to the Millicom payroll. So Millicom became my predominant focus, but not exclusive focus. And my role there was as he dictated. And broadly speaking, it related to supporting the acquisition of new licenses, those businesses that were up and running, supporting them, and that had a broad definition, whatever his definition was in terms of support, and essentially helping the company grow and thrive in often very challenging environments,
I
dealing
mean,
with governments, all the things you know from the direct experience.
yeah, I mean, when we say challenging environments, and these aren't secrets, right? They were,
No,
they
no,
were.
no, no,
I
no. This
mean,
is
you
public
know,
record, public record.
yeah, we had it was before I joined, it was gone, but we had an operation in Iran. We had an operation in the DRC, Tanzania, Ghana.
Yes.
I mean, it was there were. I remember when I got the job, my daughter, who was I think like 13 at the time, said,
Hmm.
"Finally, you get to go to someplace interesting." This is like we were living in Brussels at the time, so I'm not sure what her idea of interesting was, but they were definitely interesting. She was right about
Hmm.
that. Stenbeck had, I used to see it around the office when I got there. They had been, I think, sanitized a bit, but he had this thing called the golden rules. And some of them I always thought were great. Some of them were just there to make the general counsel uncomfortable. Like copy with pride.
Phraseology was perhaps via translation.
Yeah, yeah. Copy with pride and copy with pride with the proper licenses in place, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that phrase was left off for some reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I never heard the end part, just copy with pride, and I'd be like, "Okay, this'll be fun to defend when it gets
Hmm.
to that." But there were a lot of them that were great. How did the golden rules come about? And we'll touch on what some of our favorites were.
Well, he had it in his head to set. So let me speak firsthand, secondhand. Firsthand, he discussed establishing those with me, not in terms of input, or he wanted me to edit once they came to him. So he had a set of his executives in Europe get together and put a list of no more than 10. So, of course, they did 10 rules for the corporation. It was well intentioned, but probably a bit sweeping. And when I looked at them, I said, some of these could use work, but these folks put their effort into it. A little bit of translation things probably, but my vote was if these are for internal consumption only, you know, it's fine. I wouldn't edit them because I didn't want to sit down and be sallied with become the author of these 10 rules that did have some
Especially when
holes
one
in
of
them.
them was the Andy Grove quote, "Only the paranoid survive."
Yes, it was. Or as the Israeli diplomat years later said to me, if you're not paranoid, it just means you do not have enough information.
It's because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not
Hmm.
out to get you.
Yeah, right. So that's how those rules came about. They were guideposts as opposed to punishable offenses.
So some of the ones, as we talk about negotiation and
Hmm.
active listening, I think some of them you and I put into practice quite often. One was the four eyes principle.
Yes.
How would you dumb down the four eyes principle? Because it actually has a lot more
Mm.
to it than you would originally think.
Yes. So it goes far beyond trust of having two people in the meeting so that one-on-one, one person comes out and reports back what one person wants to report back. So there's a touch of that when you have two people in the room. But more importantly, you get the force multiplier of having the second person, something that you and I did variations of that over the years. And that was really the driving principle of it. That's why he wanted all meetings to be four eyes. Now, there were some exceptions. So on occasion, I might meet a diplomat in a government official in a given country to have discussions, and I was not required to have a second person. They felt the one-on-one dialogue, the one-on-one interaction would be beneficial to Millicoms.
Right.
That's how I would go. So it was not hard and fast, but it was, again, a guideline.
Yeah, I think the way you and I came to look at it was there were certainly times that I did things on my own and and I didn't follow you around the world either. We were together an awful lot, and I think both of us kind of made a call as to neither one of us was going to bind the company to anything without
Right.
talking by ourselves. But then we would talk about how useful is it. And I mean, for me, I remember, the trips we did to Washington where we were in a fight with an African country about our license, and that country was seeking, I think, about $600 million from the U.S. government at that time. So we were, in my mind, causing good trouble. But the Four Eyes principle came into play in those meetings because we would go into a room and there might be 10, 15 people that we'd
Sure.
be meeting with. And I'd have to and one of them might be, a congressman or woman, as the case may be. I couldn't do anything other than keep myself totally focused on the member of Congress in front of me. And we'd come out of the meeting and I'd say, "What do you think happened in there?" And I'd be amazed at all the things that happened in there that I didn't see because it wasn't my job. Right?
Right.
I just had to stay focused on them. You're nodding. This is where I'm just I talk and talk and talk. But talk about
That's
picking
correct.
up, but you were picking up, I could hear everything that was happening. You
Mhm.
were picking up nonverbal cues. How did you do that? What was important to you in doing that?
So coming back to the point, over the years, I learned that it was a couple of things would come to mind. When I had the opportunity, I would like to get together with the opposing group in the setting we've all agreed on and spend a few minutes, polite dialogue and chatter. And what I was doing was I was not listening to what they say. I was trying to absorb the dynamic within that small team. Who's the obvious leader, and sort of cataloging how they appear to interact. And that was, for lack of a better term, sort of a baseline. And then when our folks came in and we all sat down, then I was silent the whole time. And what I would do is I would take notes occasionally. And my role was by being silent, I was a presence. And I was able to, as the negotiator, would carry the weight of the meeting like you did in your role. My role was to pay attention to what was happening as you delivered the points, as you delivered the talking points, as you delivered the arguments. And sometimes I would write down what was going on, sometimes I wouldn't, but I made a point of capturing reactions, and I would also monitor the time, so I knew what time those reactions happened. And when we were on a break, then I could sit with you or another negotiator and say that when you raised this topic at about 9:45, this person reacted and that person reacted. And this is not some version of body language reading. When you watch some of the programs now, they say, "Oh, the body language expert is saying what this person is really meaning." It's
And here I
never
look
that.
up and to the left to say that I
Yeah,
think you're completely full of it, right?
it's
Yeah.
never that pop psychology stuff. It is a matter of having done it 70, 80 times. You just begin to almost graph how these meetings generally go. How do they start? Generally speaking, how long does the middle part last? When is the break? And all that time, you're looking at the ebb and flow on the other side of the table. And the issue was capturing that in notes. And the art of note-taking, as it were, is that you also write down what I refer to as cover notes. You never just write when something's important. You just every now and then, so that you're not revealing what your actual areas of interest are. It's a lot more attention demanding than it sounds, and you also have to watch out for biases that we all carry into the room, and whether you're being swayed by your own biases. But in essence, that's how I did. That's how I worked, and I got better. By the time you were there, I was a little better than the first time I did it.
We used to always make sure before we went into a meeting, and sometimes we would be at breakfast, we would review
Mm.
the 8 meetings we were having that day. Sometimes there was
Yes,
one big meeting, but I don't think we ever went into a meeting without a plan.
correct. Absolutely. How do you start? And how do you introduce the points? And then there's a recalibration when I should say micro recalibrations when we were on break. And we were able to do that based on the observations, based on the quantitative forward motion that you or another negotiator would achieve, right? And where was that in terms of the plan we agreed to before entering that room? One of the things that I would make a comment on to a member of a negotiating team, if that person said prior to the meeting, let's see how this goes, and say, whoa, hold on a second. We're not going to go in with the mindset of let's see how we do, let's see how this goes. We're going in with the mindset of this is what we're achieving before the noon hour. And that kind of structure at least would be the guardrails that would keep people focused on getting to that interim point.
Right. And I think when you talk about recalibrations, you're not talking about, well, we went in with a goal to do X. It looks like we're not going to get X. Why don't we see if Y and Z are on the table? If we went in with the goal of X, if we didn't get somewhere near X, we didn't conclude a negotiation.
Correct. And I self-corrected, or I hope it came across and you heard me. I self-corrected by saying micro recalibrations.
Right. That's what I picked up on and went there with it.
Right.
Because I don't know if people know what micro recalibration means, but I understood what you meant.
Yeah. It's a tweak here and there, but not a change of path.
Right. And that gets to goal setting for negotiations. And you brought up time. A lot of people will try to use time for or against them. Let it be used against them. Try and use it for them in a negotiation. Can you just talk about how you thought about time in setting up a negotiation and in going through it?
Yeah. So in the process of it is where I was much more focused on what it is and what it is doing. I try to keep the mindset that time needs to be my ally, and if it's my ally, it can't be theirs. Now, it's not quite binary like that, but if we're aware of the time in the room, how much time are we spending on a given topic? Are we dwelling too long on that topic? That something like that could be an example of a slight calibration when we take a break or a coffee break. I would point that out and say, well, we spend 8 minutes on this, and at breakfast, not with you necessarily, Neil, but I'm saying with the negotiator.
Yeah.
We spend 8 minutes in the room on that, and we spend 2 over coffee at breakfast on that. So that's okay, but is that a conscious decision? Is that something that's moving us forward? So to me, time is on the sort of an XY axis. Time is a very, very critical component of what is happening in that room in sequence. What is going on? Are we being pulled down a different path? If you're aware of time, I would suggest that the negotiator can be even more aware of what is the other party attempting to do. What is the other party attempting to elicit? And that's why I had always been quite sensitive to the clock in the room. And having said that, I'm not staring at the clock like I need to get out for a coffee or something. It's a little less obvious than that. But I am aware of what topics, how long, and that's why I mentioned earlier that I would brief or during the break. I would brief and say at this point on the clock during this topic, this individual I was surprised that this individual reacted, and I would let you know.
Right. Yeah, and I think there are times when you are sent, neither one of us were the principal. I mean, there's an argument that there is no single principal in any corporation. It's maybe the board of directors, I guess, ultimately. but we were always sent kind of with marching orders of what we were trying to
Yes.
get and by when. And there were times when we had to push back at the people sending us to say, if your expectation is we're going to go to Washington and we're going to come home with exactly what you want, you need to recalibrate your expectations of us.
Yes. Well, managing the expectations before we hit the road was important. And I do not recall ever running afoul of the expectations, ones that we sort of finalized before getting on the airplane or taking the Acela to Washington. And with an explanation, especially in the Washington environment, people who haven't been in it are not overly familiar with the to and fro and of getting things done and getting meetings and assuring the right people are in those meetings and all of those bits and pieces that can work against you.
Going back to some of the four eyes, some of the golden rules, one of my favorites was never give without getting.
Yeah, which was over time, I think that got reduced to a less useful guide.
Which
Never given without getting. I forget how the original phrasing was, but that may be the super summary of the intent.
So talk about the more macro version of that.
Never give without getting. Piece of that came from a discussion Uri Severe, who was the Israeli lead negotiator in the 93 Oslo Accords and someone who worked with Mr. Stembeck and was a friend. He and a colleague of his, David Kimchi, who was the former deputy foreign minister of Israel and held other titles in that government, they put together a negotiation module for a set of us, and that was held in an offsite. And one of the young executives, one of the young MBA executives, was assigned to take notes on the points raised by Uri and David in negotiating. So that's one of the things that came out of it, which was not exactly what Uri Severe was talking about. So with that as background, never give unless you get is a variation of you are giving some things that may not be important, and you're trying to get things that are a little more important. And this was in a process. Firstly, you're talking about nation-state negotiators in terms of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and some of the techniques that both sides were using in their negotiating strategies in the room. So the never give without getting is somewhat accurate, but out of context, it was not something you do every time you're sitting to negotiate the purchase of a switch or something else for a telecommunications operation. That's where it didn't have an application. I hope that's clearer than before.
Yeah, I used to use it with the business to explain to them that what they couldn't do was negotiate all the points they cared about and then hand it to me as if it was fully baked and say, here, now go do the legal stuff. Because I would say, you cannot give away all of the stuff that we don't care about when there are things that I will still care about that you don't necessarily know to care about. And you can't, and I just can't walk into a negotiation where you have done all of the giving and leave me only to get. Right. And I think that helped me be more effective in the negotiations, just to keep saying to them, I've got to be in early. I need to understand the situation before it comes down to, I'm here to rescue you because your deal's going south.
Right. So in that structure, in Uri Severe's structure, you would be a principal person inputting into what the give-get would be. And you're describing the situation, which I recall, Neil, where, right, sometimes the executives would come out and said, well, we did give to get, here's what we got, now sort it legally. So yes. So that was not the intention of it. And that's earlier when I commented that it was an interpretation of an interpretation by the time it was written down on the piece of paper and given to the executives in the Stembeck group. But it did not capture the original meaning of it, which is what we just covered.
Right. I mean, and that's kind of the problem with tricks and rules. And, I've got my 12 negotiating rules that I think were 10 before you got a hold of it and showed me two things I had missed. But we can do 12. 12 is okay. Everything doesn't have to be 10.
Mm.
And, like one of them I have is listen more than you talk.
Right.
Which people that know me around here would be surprised that that's ever a thing I would say. But the point is, when you are not talking, you need to actually listen. And it's very hard. I think it was very hard for me as a young lawyer to get out of my head because you're hearing the other side and you're like, ooh, I've
Sure.
got a response to that. I've got a response to that. And you're formulating your response.
Mhm.
You could totally miss the next 5 things that are said.
Right. The art of listening, as it were, right, is that you have to pay attention discreetly to what is being said, as opposed to what we all have a tendency to do, which is while the other person is speaking, I'm thinking about, well, I've covered 4 of my 7 points. Now I have to figure out when to get the other 3 in. That sort of approach. And that's when you miss some of the key phraseology that is being used in the points that are being made to you. So that's the issue of of careful listening. It takes time to learn how to do that. And the discipline. It's sort of not how we're wired.
And that's why how do you feel about taking notes if you're the one in the hot seat?
Well, that's fine to do as long as somebody else is covering your flanks. Yeah,
How do
that's
you mean?
fine. Well, you can write down what you find helpful outside a structured negotiation session in a room. In a regular conversation, I take notes. It's a function of how I think. I take them, I write it down. It helps generate the flow of other thoughts or comments. It helps me structure it. And I don't know why, but the physicality of writing is helpful to me in some situations. So if that is the preference of the lead negotiator, the assumption is that person is an active listener and not missing something because they're writing, and that the writing is actually a tool that is to their benefit. And I would be in the room and I'll do the writing, which is a tool for us and a tool against them, which is slightly different structure.
Right. So when you and I were doing that, if I was the one doing the talking, I would often have note paper in front of me or around me.
Hmm?
And my purpose in taking notes was not to have any kind of even close to record of a key point of the meeting. My point of taking notes was to allow myself to keep listening.
Well, I follow. Yeah, I do.
Right.
I follow that. Yeah.
Right. So if someone said something, rather than be rude and interrupt, even though I knew that I had a counterpoint to that needed to come out, I would make a 1 or 2 word note. So like if you come out of that meeting and look at my notes, you won't have any idea what happened in the meeting, right? You'll just know I'm trying to keep listening and I make a quick note so that I know there's something I got to come back to.
Yes. Yes. It's the discipline of how you do it.
But it is very hard when you're in that spot to keep listening. And if you're not listening, you're not achieving the purpose of, well, I guess, what is the purpose of negotiation in your mind?
Well, it's very tempting to say win, but the
Everybody know it's all win-win.
I guess to me, the point of negotiation is to start with the idea of getting all of the things that we believe we should get out of the deal or the relationship, and with a willingness to hear counter arguments, less of a willingness to yield to those counter arguments. But ultimately, you may have to find a little bit of give on both sides to get to signature. That's my simple structure of the purpose of a negotiation. A little bit of the process is buried into that comment, but that's how I see it.
What do you do with people that get emotional in negotiation?
If they're on our side,
Either way.
well, if they're on our side, then I won't bring them back in. I'm very simple about that because even in the pre-brief, we used to discuss it as well. It's a discipline, stick to the discipline. Emotions are useful when planned. Emotions are not useful when unplanned on our side. Now, on the other side, if you elicit...
Okay, but planned emotions are not emotions, right?
Well, well, they can be if you present
They
them
can
right.
look like it.
Well, but if it's a tool, yeah. So I get your drift in terms of something is said or something. I mean, I don't know what could it be? An insult or an inadvertent insult, or you challenge my intelligence by saying something like this to me, or how could you think that I'm so stupid that I would agree to that? I get those things can happen in the room, and rather than react negatively to those, you recognize that it's okay. What can I do with that vulnerability? That's the quick takeaway. And maybe declare a pause, or let's get a coffee, or let's take a moment and then get with the team team meaning 2 or 3 of us, and, see, okay, how can we leverage that? That's what I would do with emotional outbursts on the other side. There is a little bit of a question of what slipped in I'll just personalize it, my delivery. What slipped in my delivery in that room that precipitated that reaction? If I wanted to precipitate that reaction, that's good. But if I wanted to see what would happen, and I don't mean let me see where this goes, I'm talking about a structured probe of their sensitivity on a given matter. Now, if I precipitated the reaction, then okay. But if there was a reaction, a strong reaction on the other side to something that we had considered was a reasonable approach in the negotiating session, then we have to recalibrate what we're doing. We have to think about what we're doing. Take a break, take a breath, and say, okay, how did we lose control of the reins here? So that would be my takeaway from from
Yeah,
from the outburst.
and for somebody that is starting off negotiating early in their career, I mean, I think a rule of thumb for me that I discovered through making mistakes
Hmm.
was if they got me angry and I allowed myself to be angry, I was about to make a mistake.
Certainly. No, I agree with you. That's why earlier I commented that I would ask for a break and I would speak to the person on our team and say, if you cannot control yourself, you cannot come back in for that very reason, because it is a mistake.
Yeah.
And it
And
can be, sometimes it can be costly, irrespective of whether it's immediately costly or not. There is a recovery time in the next session from that outburst. And it is a distraction and ultimately a negative to the position that we would be presenting.
yeah, I mean, without getting too deep into that one situation, I remember that one of the things that you and I were dealing with that country was that 10 years before, somebody had gone into a meeting and called the president a crook.
Yeah, that was not a good idea.
No, and we spent 10 years trying to overcome it.
Yes, things like that take time to repair,
Well,
especially when you knew at the time the odds were he'd still be president in 10 years.
and well, it turned something that was about money into about his honor.
Exactly. And
And
when you touch honor, it's no longer a meeting.
let's talk about some of the other negotiation rules, guidelines. However, I think we've covered to death maybe. You can't underestimate the value of preparation for a negotiation. How do you prepare? How do you go about preparing?
For me, it's a quantitative prep. In other words, if you and I sat together or a different negotiating team sat together, what is it we have? What do we want? How are we trying to get there? How do we structure the meeting? Personally, I don't have a prep per se. I go in comfortable that I know my role and I'm comfortable with the teammates that I'm in there with. So I get right to it. As I said, I try to get in the room a few minutes early. I'll leverage everything I can. If we can get the seats that control the access to the door, I'll do that. You and I have discussed that, right? Any leverage I can get, I'll do in the room. So that's my mindset walking in. Otherwise, I'm completely comfortable.
Well, and part of the preparation though was we knew who was doing what role.
Yeah.
And we didn't there was never any confusion about because sometimes you get into a negotiation and all of a sudden the third chair has decided to pipe up and you're like,
Yes.
you were here to learn. You weren't here to be talking.
That a few times that happened long time ago. Unfortunately, in a couple of situations in Europe where a younger person decided to add some comments that were not, shall we say, pre-cleared by the censors. So we had to have that discussion over coffee on a sidebar. Fortunately, it wasn't repeated. But yes, so somebody can try to be helpful, and they do. The script needs to be pretty much followed, meaning there's one lead negotiator, and then after that, you don't want depending on how many of our team would be in there, you don't want to broadcast to the other side the roles of those ancillary persons that are in the room. And somebody bursting out and offering an opinion or offering a view has thrown off that dynamic, and it is never good.
What do you do when the party on the other side, you've been sent to hopefully achieve a particular result? Let's just make it numeric for, they send you to get 100. The other side insists that they don't have authority to give you more than 75. What do you do to get to 100?
So this is now the issue of who has authority to do what in the room, and that's one way to find out when the actual ask goes and the person says, "Well, I simply can't do that." Then the question becomes: is you can't do that, or you won't ask to do that, right? That's the issue. Cannot versus will not. And as long as it's not will not, then there's some maneuvering. If it is absolutely no, no, I'm not going to do that. Absent more specifics of the scenario, then it might be time to withdraw, and recalibrate, and then reopen negotiations. And perhaps there might be a different person in the room, or the decision maker might say, give them 90 or give them 95 or something.
But in my situation, you don't just drop to 75 because that's the best you could do.
No, 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 I wouldn't. I would withdraw before I did that, because then that's a defeat.
Right. But because when someone on the other side takes that position,
Mhm.
that they don't have authority to do what you're asking them to do, they can't give you now in that session what you want, because they will either reveal themselves to have been lying earlier, and people don't like to be like, I was lying earlier.
Right.
Right? They can always come back in another session. You can always say, "Hey, why don't we withdraw? I need to call back to the office and
Yes,
tell them
yes,
what's happening. Maybe you do the same,
yes.
and let's reconvene."
Well, that's part of the withdrawal, to
Right.
leave the environment so that you're not cornering the individual. You're not embarrassing the individual. You're not making the individual look bad in front of their teammates, but letting them out by saying, well, I have to make some calls. Why don't you make some calls and talk to your talk to your decision making group, rather than maybe saying your decision maker, and let him off the hook, and then see if he comes back what I would call rational at that point.
Segue to, how do you react when the arguments coming from the other side are just completely irrational, made up nonsense?
Well, facts are a stubborn thing, so I would rely on facts to counter to a point, and point out the information we've already agreed to, and then supplement it with some other facts. If at that time they continue to be irrational, then I'm not a psychotherapist. I mean, we have to pull back and say, well, I have to share what you're telling me. I have to share this with some of my colleagues, and we'll reconvene. I mean, fighting them in the room over something that is irrational, then it becomes irrational on our part to fight it to the point where the negotiations fall apart.
Right, because, for me, whenever I heard arguments like that, and you put an important point in there, what have we already agreed to? It's like when the rationality's gone out on the other side, it's time to recalibrate and say, "Okay, what can we agree to? What can we say
Hmm.
that we've moved forward as
Yes.
a result of this negotiation?" Even though everybody's hoping that, you and I come out with a deal, although I can't remember ever being sent into one of those things with the expectation that we were going to emerge with a deal. They might have
Hmm.
had a parade for us if we did. But you say, "Okay, here's where I can move the ball forward. Here are things that we can narrow to
Yeah.
put them in the non-issue or settled issues pile."
Yeah. So it's like it's almost like a positive summary of where we are so far, and say, well, you and I are on common ground regarding, if you want to avoid the word agreed, you and I are on common ground regarding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We still have work to do on 6 and 7, and I hear what you are saying to me, but can't I can't deal with that right now. I have to get back to some people. Maybe you get back to some of your folks, and then let's reconvene and see what we can do with it. But so far we have 1 through 5 on common ground. That's a positive step.
And that way you can try to end a negotiation that's not resulting in,
Hmm.
celebration and champagne, in a way that people don't walk out of it upset, angry. They can go back to their superiors, whoever, and say, "We made progress."
Yes. And it is possible that that crisis that they are precipitating with the totally irrational demands is their timed and planned point of exit. And that's also important for me or the team to keep in mind, that most things that happen in that room, if it's a sophisticated team opposite you, all things that happen in that room are planned. And so one doesn't become emotional over the fact that the person across the table from you has become emotional. Because if they're good, they might have picked their time and their reason to raise their voice or slam the table and say, I'm not giving any more, I'm not doing this, telling you all the things they will not do. But it's a negotiating tactic, so you treat it accordingly.
See,
Sometimes I've seen it where you almost respect how good it is.
yeah,
I have to try that.
I remember sitting in a presidential palace in the south of the equator and almost closed a deal that was well below what the other side could have got,
Hmm.
and and was like almost my opening offer, and he was threatening to take it, the president's aide. Like some guy in the corner just lost his mind,
Well,
started screaming and yelling at me, and I'm
well,
like, okay, that's game. You know, game recognizes game. I would have
yes.
done the same thing if my client lost his mind in the middle of the negotiation.
Well, that was also the emergency intervention. Yeah, yeah. And once you see it, you say, okay, you can deal with it.
You know, another of the, David Kimchi, Yuri Severe rules that got uh, MBAs took notes. Everybody
Mm.
had an MBA but you and me in that company.
Yeah,
They
well,
would all have they would all have a student MBA, a recent graduate MBA working for them who was always taking and misinterpreting notes.
yeah,
And one
but they
of
did know
them
a lot.
they were very smart young men generally, sometimes young
Hmm.
women, but they would so the one that I always heard thrown back at me is sometimes it's useful to create a crisis in a negotiation.
Yes, another misinterpretation of what our friends Uri and David were trying to pass to us. And by the way, at that session I referenced earlier, where Uri and David were discussing negotiations, not just tactics, but the I call it the universe of negotiations involving the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority. The lead negotiator for the Palestinian side attended. They became friends during and after the negotiations in Oslo. They became actual friends. His name is Abu Allah, not Allah, the God, Abu Allah. And he was a very interesting individual. His talking points were very similar to those of David and Uri. So these were world-class negotiators with teams sitting across from each other. David was not at the 93 Accords to be those negotiations at the Oslo Accords. It was Uri, and the Abu Allah was his counterpart. But they were two world-class negotiators using many of the same techniques to reach a deal.
But it also kind of goes to, when you talk about Stenbeck and what an interesting guy he was, most of us were watching TV in the early 90s and go, Oslo Accords, that's interesting. Stenbeck's reaction was, those must be the best negotiators in the world. I'm going to hire
Yeah.
them.
He brought on Uri and David around the same time. We got together in New York, and I said, I'm a very lucky individual. I mean, how else would I have ever gotten to know those two individuals, plus others that were just very, very interesting people and
So I got
accomplished
you off
people.
topic though.
Yeah.
What was the Uri and David point on sometimes it's useful to create a crisis in more fulsome?
Yes. So creating the crisis in their optic, it was timed, structured, never impulsive. That's the first point. When they said to create a crisis, they meant to form it, and when the time was right, should I use it or not use it? That's the second decision, right? And then the third piece of that is execute it and walk out, or not necessarily storm out. That's more of the movies. And there is a movie on the Oslo Accords, by the way. But
In
some
my
of that was
entire
not
career, I
accurate.
stormed out of a meeting once, and it was so stupid because there wasn't anything to negotiate, and we were 2 days away
Mm.
from when the signatories showed up, so I got bored. So, a bad reason to create a crisis, but even worse, the junior guy I had with me didn't get up and leave with me when I stormed out, so I
You
had
had
to
to
go
go
back
back and say,
I had to go back in for him.
turn the page on the script. We march out now. Yes.
I was like, "Oh, this
Oh,
is embarrassing. I'm not trying
yeah.
this ever again."
I bet the people on the other side of the table said, "Oh man, poor guy."
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, we all knew that there was really nothing to negotiate, but here we
right.
were with 2 days to fill to negotiate.
Yeah.
I luckily at that point, what I was really trying to do is shut down my lawyers running the clock,
Yeah, well, look, fair enough. That's a structured reason to do it.
I guess.
But in terms of the younger executives in the group, there was a little bit of a tendency, which we had to put some water on this fire. There was a tendency to begin early discussions about where and when the disruption would occur. If the various negotiations on the telecom side. I
Yeah.
mean, really, most of the time you don't have to spend an hour making up a structure of when you're going to disrupt the negotiations and storm out because it's on a piece of paper. That was never the intention of the rule, obviously.
Yeah, and the rules, they're not rules.
They're
They're
really
helpful
guidelines.
things
They
until
would,
they're
yeah,
not.
right. Yeah, and that's a fair binary because as they percolated through the ranks, the executive ranks from top to the ascending senior executives, right? They became rigid. So the further they spread out, the more solid they became. And I'm not exaggerating where I was at a meeting where the small team literally was talking about what kind of crisis can we create and when should we do it. They had not yet entered the room on the primary points of the negotiation. They were literally creating almost a table. It's not truly a matrix, but with the boxes and what
Yeah.
do I do now? And I said, guys, no, just go in there and be smart.
Yeah, I mean, one example I can give from post Millicom days is, listen more than you talk is great.
Mm,
N But I had a situation where I was negotiating with the person who pretended he wasn't paying attention, right? So it was me and a junior lawyer, the
hmm
principal on the other side doing his emails on his computer, and 2 junior lawyers, and he just would sit and listen the whole time, never
hmm
speak, until every once in a while I notice that if I kept going on a subject for more than a few minutes, I'd see his hands go back from his keyboard, he'd pull his hands back in from the table, and he would start listening, and then I'm like, "Okay, so I have to go on for a while to get him to listen because these 2 don't have any authority to give me what I want, only he does, and if I can't get his attention, I'm not getting anywhere." So, that was where I completely threw out "Listen more than you talk." I was so tired at the end of the day, I'd been listening to myself yammer on for like 10 hours, but we got the deal done.
Yes, and listen more than you speak, again, was a rule of thumb, as opposed to this is how you must behave in that room. Sometimes it makes sense to run on, consciously run on, to achieve a particular effect in the negotiations. And sometimes it can be a technique to make it appear that you're becoming vulnerable. So everything matters in that room. How one comports oneself, the voice, inflections. This is your audience and you are totally attuned to all of that. But I do have in terms of sort of the presentation of being in the room, this is one of the few times I had to be deposed. I was an expert at staying out of trouble. And there was a couple of, this is not not the case that you and I
Right.
know of. It's a different case. And so I had to go into these big law firm in Manhattan and all the partners are in there. And I had 2 partners with me and it was, there was a Washington lawyer on the call in and all of that. So long and short, I said, all right, well, I'm not really in a negotiating position here, but I want to be in a disarming position. So what I learned is that sometimes the best thing to do is to appear as though everyone else in that room is smarter than you. It can help. So in the old days, Neil, I used to keep a shirt that was one size collar too big. Okay. And yes, you're getting the drift right now. You come in, not with your best suit. All right. Brown shoes instead of black shoes, the whole bit. The belt doesn't quite match. And
Eddie from the
I know everybody sees everything.
Yeah.
And then I would sit there and in they march, prima donna 1, prima donna 2, prima donna 3. And I said, okay, I may be all right. And of course, I knew where they wanted to go in the discussion and I kept avoiding it. And eventually, I was cut free, as it were. But my point is, I have such respect for what can go on in a negotiating room, or in that case, the room I was describing in the august law firm, that I treat everything as important. And it was important to me to look like I was a rollover. And it helped. At least I convinced myself it helped.
I've had the misfortune of having to testify many, many times, partly because the attorney-client privilege in Europe is not near what it
Mm,
is in the US, so nobody ever said, he can't be forced to testify about that, he was giving legal advice." And it's like, "Nope, we're called Mr.
hmm
Taylor, here we go." But what I found, and I think it applies as well to negotiation, is when I was asked a question, I never started speaking until I knew where I was ending.
No, absolutely. And so from the old days, if I can interject here, because it's there, I was taught a long time ago that the first thing you do with the question is sort of inside, very quickly do an analysis. Why am I being asked that now in this sequence? Where are they trying to take me? And how will my answer either move me toward where they want to go or move me toward where I want to go? That's just a variation of what you just said. That it is so important to stay in tune of, and ask oneself, where is this person taking me in the conversation? That relates to when normally, unless we're disciplined, when someone is speaking to you, you're sort of half listening and think, not you, Neil, one is sort of half listening and thinking about my next question or my next statement, spending a moment and saying, okay, process the question. Where are they taking me? Why? And do I want to go there or not? And how do I respond? Is a matter of that discipline in the room.
And it brings me back to time. Right?
hmm
Especially when I was very junior, I was so conscious of time and everyone else's time. They're going to think I'm stupid if I don't answer every question. Boom, 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 boom. And there is always enough time to do it
hmm
well.
Yeah, and
And
use it as your ally. Another small thing I think we talked about a long time ago is one case in negotiations in Washington. We had our legal firm, external counsel, send a couple of their partners there, and we're meeting on a Friday morning, and I'm in the same hotel as these folks. I come down to the lobby, and there they are with all their luggage. They're going to bring the luggage to the entity where we're supposed to be negotiating.
right.
And I said, okay, folks, leave your luggage here. Well, what's the difference? I'll go to the airport from there. I said, no, you're advertising you want to get out. You're advertising you want to leave at some point. We need to present ourselves as we'll stay here all weekend if we need to. And the topic mattered that much, right? But that's sometimes even the best trained, highly compensated, competent individuals, everyone can make a slip like that. And my role was to just be aware of as much as I could be aware of that could badly influence us or positively influence our outcome in the negotiations. That's what Mr. Stembeck paid me for.
What did I miss?
Nothing jumps to mind. I think over the years we have discussed variations of this. And the question is whether I have successfully encapsulated some of this for the audience, because I'm kind of speaking to my old friend here one on one. I forget that I'm recorded. And I'll leave it there.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I really
This was
appreciate your time.
enjoyable. It really was enjoyable. And I hope it proves interesting and potentially useful.